The New Companion Revelation, Evidence of Spiritual Wifery in the First British Mission. By Jeremy W. Hoop. Journal of Mormon Polygamy Vol. 1, No. 1, 2025. In his mission journal, Joseph Fielding records one of the longest and most astonishing entries on the evening of Thursday, September 2, 1841, just weeks prior to leaving his missionary labors in Preston and Manchester, England. He pens striking details of a certain principle manifested in Manchester and Preston of which he had learned only a short time ago. Born in 1797, Fielding was raised 160 miles to the south in Bedfordshire. At the age of 35, he emigrated to Upper Canada. About 3 years later, he encountered Mormon missionaries and joined their church, being baptized by Parley Pratt in May, 1836. The following year, he was called to serve a mission in Preston and Manchester with Mission President Heber Kimball. He was ordained an elder by President Kimball and appointed his successor when Kimball returned to America in April of 1838. Fielding served in that capacity until Brigham Young took his post in July 1840. After that, Fielding continued to serve as a missionary under President Young and later under Parley Pratt. Fielding's journal reveals that he was a devoted missionary who deeply loved the people he ministered to and the men with whom he served. His September 1841 journal entry reveals just how shaken he was to learn of things that had been going on right under his nose, involving some of those people he loved so dearly. Over the previous weeks and only by degrees, Fielding became aware of a select little company amongst the saints in Manchester who had been much afraid of him knowing of these things. He learned that this group looked upon themselves as better than the rest. They met together as a choice band where they obtained manifestations which it was not lawful to tell to the common saints nor even to him, though at that time presiding. The manifestations of this covert group of Manchester Mormons, which were guarded with strict secrecy, pertained to what Fielding calls the New Companion Revelation. Fielding does not record who had received this revelation, nor does he give specific details about its contents. However, he does explain that the revelation opened these saints to many strange visions that came mostly through women. These prophetesses, as he calls them, through dreams and prophesyings were able to have it shown them, who should be companions in another world, that they would not be united as they are now. Apparently, these women had visions through dreams. From these they could declare prophecies that allowed married people to believe they were meant to be with spiritual companions other than their spouses. Others, females, have prophesied of things pertaining to the elders. One, that an elder's wife would die and he should be married to another certain person, and the elder, for want of experience more, I think, than the want of honesty, really thought it was true or from the Lord. I felt much grieved for the sis, who was to die, a faithful sister. These kind of prophetesses would also say. The sister who declared this prophecy had received it through a dream. Fielding notes that he often cautioned this sister to be careful about her dreams and told her if her "I were not single her dreams" would be mixed with error. I also endeavored to show the elders that the priesthood was to govern and not be led by females' dreams on prophesyings or by anyone else. Fielding tried to persuade some that the companion revelation was not of God, and if one of the 12 should sanction it, I should still reject it. Soon after he learned of it, he saw Elder Parley P. Pratt in Manchester, and asked him if it were of God. Parley's answer was no. But then, in a curious twist, Fielding adds, it had been the same in Manchester, while a certain female from Preston was living there. Someone had been marked out for him, Parley P. Pratt. He doesn't elaborate further on the new companion, who was chosen for the apostle. Apparently, these manifestations caused a fair amount of animosity. The prophetesses asserted power to pass judgment on some of the saints, declaring they would see who would stand and who would not. I told them there was no decree against any one, all might stand, and it was the will of God that all should overcome. These prophetesses would also pronounce curses upon their fellow saints, and one sister even pronounced a curse on Fielding. Fielding then mentions that the behavior of the Manchester saints was not merely confined to spiritual manifestations. He writes, another thing I will mention here, there had been a too great familiarity between the brethren and sisters in this land. We are not told the exact nature or level of the familiarity between the male and female saints in Manchester, only that Fielding felt guilty that he too had participated. He expresses relief that he had not indulged beyond familiarity. I feel myself to be weak, but the Lord has preserved me, at least from action and sin. To God be all the praise. Yeah, I am very thankful that I have been thus preserved. Fielding explains that when the apostles had returned in 1840, they checked this evil, although he is not explicit who they refer to. But it is equally likely, perhaps more so, that he meant the brethren and sisters in this land were the ones who censored their own behavior upon the arrival of the 12. He then writes, "Yet some who came from America went far beyond anything we had ever done or sanctioned." Whoever those Americans were, the behavior went from the evil of too great familiarity to much worse. Then, Fielding recounts this tragic news. While I was in Manchester last week, I was informed that a sister was in a state of pregnancy by an elder who persuaded her it mattered not how familiar they were with one another, so long as they did not actually commit adultery or fornication. The couple tempted fate, went to bed together, were overcome, and a pregnancy resulted. Fielding's description suggests that for these seducible saints, being familiar may have implied a license to engage in romantic physical interactions, actions they believed were proper, so long as they stopped just short of adultery or fornication. Nonetheless, the familiarity between this couple ultimately led to an unintended pregnancy after the elder persuaded the sister there was no harm in their behavior because EC had often slept with Sis P. This elder C, Fielding explains, had been influenced by some of the American brethren's behavior so much so that he had gone to bed with different women and endeavored to persuade them it was no harm. Fielding does not divulge the full identity of Elder C, so the reader is left to try and deduce which of the elders in Manchester he was referencing. Finally, Fielding mentions one more elder's behavior. It seems also that Elder T has been cut off from the church since he returned to America for the like sin. Fielding concludes with this lament, "What do their wives think of such things?" While Fielding wrote about the companion revelation and the immoral behavior of Manchester Mormons in the same entry, he isn't expressly clear if the two were connected. Fielding's imprecise wording leaves the reader to try to ascertain if they were connected or not. It is possible that he was recounting two unconnected activities: a clandestine group of Manchester saints who received manifestations about new spiritual companions, and another group of Manchester Mormons who were behaving immorally. It appears more likely, however, given what he writes about Elder C and Elder T, that he believed the doctrine in the companion revelation fostered an environment in Manchester where familiarity turned into greater sexual sins. As will be shown, other evidence indicates that the sexual behavior and the companion revelation were indeed connected. The implications of Fielding's September 2nd, 1841 journal entry are profound. If sufficient evidence of spiritual wifery among the Mormons in England can be identified, then it would indicate polygamous activity, unconnected to Joseph Smith, occurring well outside the standard LDS polygamy narrative's timeline. Moreover, if that evidence can be linked to known early Nauvoo polygamists, then perhaps we have the beginnings of a new origin story for early Mormon polygamy. The companion revelation and spiritual wifery. Fielding's extensive September 2nd, 1841 journal entry reveals a startling fact: a documented form of promiscuous spiritual wifery, distinct, predating, and unconnected to John Bennett's Nauvoo spiritual wife system. It appears that the British mission spiritual wifery practice was unique compared to other forms, such as John Bennett's, or that of the Society of Free Brethren and Sisters, also known as the Cochranites. John Bennett's spiritual wife system, which began in Nauvoo shortly after the British version, was fairly rudimentary. It could be argued Bennett and company merely advanced a ruse to have unlawful intercourse with multiple female partners. They claimed no revelation in their seduction of the women. Bennett and the men who followed him taught women that any respectable female might indulge in sexual intercourse, and there was no sin in it, provided the person so indulging keep the same to herself. These men claimed that they had been instructed by Joseph Smith, and that there was no sin where there was no accuser. In Bennett's system, a woman could have many sexual partners. The common refrain from the seducers was that there was no harm in it, so long as the women kept it secret. The similarities between Bennett's spiritual wife system and the spiritual wifery of the companion revelation appear to be: first, the insistence of there being no harm in going to bed together, as Elder C. had urged with different women. Second, it appears that some women in Manchester may also have had license to have multiple sexual partners. The primary distinction between the two was that the Bennett group seduced women by their rhetoric, using Joseph Smith's name to give their behavior legitimacy. The choice band in Manchester sought manifestations from heaven to sanction their companionships. Importantly, they did not claim Joseph Smith was the originator of their revelation or doctrine. Also, the Bennett group appear to have targeted mostly, if not exclusively, unmarried women. The Manchester Select Company allowed married people to seek out other companions. The followers of Jacob Cochran practiced a more complex form of spiritual wifery, which shared some commonalities with Mormon Manchester spiritual wifery. Both systems required strict oaths of secrecy. Both dissolved former marriages and allowed for new spiritual mates. Both groups had extraordinary dreams and visions. The Cochranites also practiced the ancient ritual of foot washing, which some of the Manchester saints appear to have practiced as well. Apostle Orson Hyde, who served a mission among the Cochranites, reports in his journal in 1832 what he learned of the Cochranites. They had a wonderful lustful spirit, because they believe in a plurality of wives, which they call spiritual wives, knowing them not after the flesh, but after the spirit. But by the appearance they knew one another after the flesh. The Cochranites' full spiritual wife practice had not become general, and many would deny that such things existed among them. With the Mormon Manchester Company, it is possible that for some of them the relations were purely spiritual. However, for others it appears to also have progressed to knowing each other after the flesh. Corroborating evidence in the historical record. Evidence for a secretive choice band, manifestations, cursings, dreams, prophesying, talk of new marriage companions, too much familiarity, and going to bed together, exists. That evidence can be discovered by first focusing on the two furtively named elders in Fielding's account, Elder T and Elder C. The fact that Fielding doesn't provide the offending elders' full names is interesting to note. Throughout his journal, he continuously documents conversations and interactions with named individuals. But in this entry, he only mentions a sister, a certain person, or an elder here and there. The only name he writes specifically is P. Parley P. Pratt. He references two elders, E.C. and E.T., and his sister P. It appears that his reticence to fully name individuals may have been out of a desire to not disclose the sins of his friends and acquaintances to posterity, who may in future read his journal. However, Fielding left enough clues for himself so he could later recall the details. While it is possible that Fielding could have named an obscure elder with whom he had little interaction, it appears more likely that E.C. and E.T. were men he was well acquainted with. Perhaps he felt shame being closely associated with people engaging in this behavior, or perhaps he wanted to protect their identities if others later were to read his words. Regardless of his reasons, Fielding doesn't name these men fully. If the mysterious Elder C and Elder T can be discovered, perhaps they will lead to more evidence of spiritual wifery in the record. E.T. Elder Theodore Turley. Who is Elder T? In Fielding's journal, besides the letters E.T., there is another clue. His asking, "What do their wives think of such things?" reveals that the elders are married men. This clue presents only two possibilities. Only two married missionaries with last names beginning in T were serving during Kimball's, Fielding's, Young's or Pratt's tenures as mission president, Elder John Taylor and Elder Theodore Turley. Fielding mentions both men frequently throughout his diary, and no other elders with a last name beginning in T are named. While nothing publicly available to date in the historical record by fall of 1841 can implicate Taylor with going to bed with different women, or even too great familiarity, there is substantial evidence pointing to Turley. Turley served a year-long mission in his native England alongside Joseph Fielding and Apostles Young, Kimball, Taylor, and Woodruff. Elder Turley prepared to return to America in the fall of 1840. It was on the voyage at sea and during the trek from New York to Nauvoo that Turley's witness behavior caused a stir in the church, and his subsequent High Council trial nearly cost him his church membership. Turley, a Mormon elder holding the office of 70, was appointed to preside over roughly 200 saints. They embarked from Liverpool for New York City with him on September 8, 1840. During the difficult passage in squalid conditions, Turley endeavored to encourage the saints in their physical and spiritual cleanliness. A number of the sisters in their company had been making very free and drinking wine with some of the sailors and passengers. Turley tried from time to time to discourage their fraternization. 39-year-old Turley was husband of Frances Kimberly and father of 9 children at this time. After disembarking on October 12 in New York, the company traveled west, first to Kirtland, Ohio, and finally arrived in Nauvoo on November 25, 1840. Elder Turley arrived in Nauvoo about the November 25th with 109 saints. The rest stopped in Kirtland. 11 saints who were on the journey with Turley reported what they had witnessed of his behavior with some of the women in the company. These witnesses brought enough evidence to prefer charges before the Nauvoo Stake High Council against Turley. The original charging document, filed January 26, 1841 by Benjamin L. Clapp and Nauvoo Legion Major William Niswanger, accuses Turley of 1. Unchristian conduct while on the sea, for romping and kissing the females, and dancing 2, for sleeping with 2 women coming up the lake and on the road to Dixon Ferry until he arrived back. Apparently Turley's bad behavior was not an errant moment, but was observed throughout the entire voyage on sea and land. Touting his high office in the priesthood, Elder Turley was at first defiant of the charges. He warned the brethren that Brother Joseph would disregard anything they reported, as he shared the same spirit and priesthood authority. He implied that if they spoke to Joseph, he would not listen to them. But after sufficient witness testimony was presented at the trial, the charges were sustained, after which the president decided that the defendant Turley, in order to retain his fellowship, should acknowledge, both before the council and also to a public congregation, that he had acted unwisely, unjustly, imprudently, and unbecoming, and that he had set a bad example before his brethren and sisters. Though Turley finally made a confession to the satisfaction of the council, and stated that he would rejoice in the opportunity of making the like confession before the public, he never acknowledged full sexual activity with the women. His kissing and romping with the girls, and having been seen going to bed with 2 unidentified women over a prolonged period, was not enough for the council to feel confident in convicting the married man of adultery. If Turley actually made a formal public confession, the record is not extant. News of Turley's actions made its way to England. On April 15, 1841, in Nauvoo, Mary and Young wrote to her husband Brigham Young, who had not yet returned from his mission in Britain. Not mincing words, she expresses her dismay at recent events concerning Brigham's friend, Theodore Turley. She writes that her heart had been pained with the example of some who journeyed from England, and that she disapproved of the familiarities that some are in favor of in that country. Of Turley, she mentions that his appearance on the journey was very disgusting to many respectable people. He repented and came back into the church again. They say he is very humble. I have not received not much from B.R. Turley, yet he says he is willing to do anything he can. It appears Joseph Fielding also received the report. The charges of Turley sleeping with 2 women were likely what Joseph Fielding references in his journal when he notes that Elder T. was cut off from the church for a similar sin. All of this evidence provides sufficiently strong proof to conclude that Joseph Fielding was indeed referring to Theodore Turley in his journal. It is important to mention that in Nauvoo Turley would take his first spiritual wife, Mary Clift, an immigrant from Herefordshire, England. She had journeyed with Turley from England to Nauvoo. Turley also married her 2 sisters, Eliza and Sarah Clift, as spiritual wives. Turley's immoral behavior on the journey from England to America, his subsequent adoption of spiritual wifery in Nauvoo, and his choice of 3 English sisters suggest the possibility that he had been introduced to a spiritual wife doctrine during his mission in England. E.C. Elder Hiram Clark. Identifying E.C. is difficult, as Fielding mentions several elders with last names starting with C. Of 7 possible married candidates, 5 are unlikely. Thomas Henry Clark and Frederick Cook are unmentioned by Fielding, while J. Clark, James Caden, and Alfred Corden are weak matches due to missing records or distant assignments. One possible candidate is Hiram Clark, a 44-year-old married elder from Vermont. Clark served 3 missions to England between late 1839 and 1846. On December 8, 1839, Clark arrived in the British mission with 2 other American elders. He served a short time in Manchester, starting in January 1840. Clark demonstrated a pattern of taking liberties with and acting inappropriately toward women. Clark left his first English mission and sailed home on March 4, 1841. On the voyage from Liverpool to New Orleans, Clark was charged with behaving himself unseemingly to Sister Marie Hardman and other females. The extent of his bad behavior isn't known, but it appears that it did not escalate to physical contact, as he was not charged with any physical sexual behavior. At most, Clark was forward in an uninvited and inappropriate way with these women. A few days later, he acknowledged publicly what he had done. Alexander Niebuhr, a Dutch saint among the group, reports in his journal, Elder H. Clark rose and said if there was any that felt offended at anything that he had done or said, he begged their forgiveness. Many shed tears at his humility. His case was not put to a vote. It is important to note the difference between Clark's behavior and that of Elder Theodore Turley. Turley's actions were serious enough to have formal charges brought in the Nauvoo High Council, and he was nearly excommunicated. Clark arrived in Nauvoo not long after Turley's trial. At that time, Turley's actions were still being discussed and written about in Nauvoo by Joseph Smith and other Nauvoo citizens. Given that no formal charges were brought against Clark in Nauvoo or elsewhere, it is reasonable to conclude that his behavior with the women was not as serious as Theodore Turley's. Moreover, Clark served a second mission to England not long after returning to Nauvoo. From June 1842 to March of 1844, Clark served as second counselor to British Mission President Reuben Hedlock. After completing this mission and returning home to Nauvoo, a rumor about Clark reached President Hedlock. On July 14, 1844, he wrote to Apostle Williard Richards and explained that he was having a good deal of trouble with the spiritual wife system, as people were calling it, among some of the branches in the church in England. Hedlock also reported that the secret practice of spiritual wifery was causing much confusion because both members and non-members alike had come to him, saying they believed the leaders of the church upheld the doctrine. Some had cited Hiram Clark as an example. They say that Brother Hiram Clark has made free with some of the sisters. Hedlock also wrote that there was a rumor that Clark used to sleep with a certain sister in Macclesfield when he was there, and also in Manchester. He did not clarify whether it was the same sister in both places. Macclesfield is a town about 40 miles south of Manchester, or more than one woman. Hedlock writes that he couldn't confirm the truth of the rumor. I know not the truth of these statements, neither do I know that Brother Clark is guilty of the crime, but the freedom that he has manifested has given rise to the reports. No further corroboration of the reports was established, and no ecclesiastical discipline was enacted against Clark over the rumor. Hedlock asked Richards to speak to Clark and caution him about his behavior, so that in case Clark returned to England, he would be more careful and be able to restore the influence he had lost with the members there. In August of 1844, the apostles in Nauvoo requested Clark to return to England. Clark did so, arriving in 1845, this time with his wife. He served his third and final mission to England without incident or any accusations of sexual misconduct. Clark's inappropriate behavior while in England makes him a potential candidate to be Fielding's Elder C. However, there are challenges in connecting him directly to the behavior Fielding described. First, during his first mission to England, there is no available evidence of sexual misconduct with women in England. There is only inappropriate and unwanted behavior that didn't arise to charges of physical contact, and only after he had left the mission field. Fielding does not mention anything negative regarding Clark during his first mission. There are no mentions of any kind of misbehavior in any letters between mission leaders. No condemning journal entries or reports exist from anyone during this time. There is not a personal journal from Clark Exton to examine. Also, Clark was only in Manchester and Preston briefly, most likely between 4 to 8 weeks. Even during that brief time, he would leave each week to preach in nearby communities from 20 to 60 miles away, and then return for short stays in Manchester. During one stretch of weeks in May and June of 1840, he appears to have been recovering from an extended illness. Starting in July of 1840, he was called to Scotland and spent the rest of his mission in Scotland and the Isle of Man. Before he returned to America, it appears he was only briefly in Manchester once more for a mission conference in October of 1840. From the record, he does not appear to have much contact or association with branch members in Manchester, especially when compared to other elders, such as Fielding or Clayton. Clark's lack of time in Manchester is significant given that Fielding's knowledge about Elder C came from members of the church in Manchester. The pregnant sister Fielding mentioned was a church member in Manchester, and the elder that impregnated her had used Elder C as his excuse to have sexual relations with her. This suggests that Elder C's activities were with women in Manchester, and it does not appear that Fielding was associating Elder C's behavior in locations outside of Manchester. The fact that Clark was only in Manchester for a short period of time makes it far less likely that he had time and opportunity to develop relationships such that he could go to bed with different women and sleep often with Sister P. Given these challenges, concluding that Hiram Clark is Fielding's Elder C requires speculation based on Clark's inappropriate behavior with women on the voyage home from his mission, and an unsubstantiated rumor that came forward 4 years later. Given that he didn't receive any formal church discipline as a result of his behavior in England, we are left only to infer he was capable of the bad behavior in order to draw conclusions without any further evidence. Clark would only be the most likely candidate for Fielding's Elder C if it weren't for another elder, for whom there is more contemporaneous and compelling evidence. Elder William Clayton. E.C. Elder William Clayton? Unlike Hiram Clark, William Clayton served extensively in Preston and Manchester for over 2 years and had a close working relationship with Joseph Fielding. In his journal, Fielding mentions Clark only a handful of times, rather perfunctorily. By contrast, Fielding writes of Clayton often and affectionately. Significantly, Fielding often truncates Clayton's name to Elder C, or Bro C. As we will see, Elder William Clayton, a 24-year-old factory clerk from Penwortham near Preston, England, is clearly the best candidate. Just weeks before leaving England for Nauvoo on April 20, 1838, President Heber C. Kimball ordained Joseph Fielding a high priest and to serve as the next president of the British mission. At the same time, William Clayton was also ordained a high priest and as second counselor to Fielding in the presidency. By mid-October 1838, Clayton was called to serve in Manchester. Clayton left his pregnant wife, Ruth, and their young child to begin his labors. It appears from Fielding's and Clayton's diaries that Clayton was a diligent missionary and beloved by many. During his 2+ years of service, Clayton may deserve the credit for growing the Preston, Manchester branch more than anyone else. Clayton left an extraordinarily detailed journal. It gives tremendous insight into Clayton as a man and missionary, and to the broader conditions and activities of the Manchester Mormons. His diminutive Manchester Diary, or Daybook, is an important and often overlooked source related to Mormon history in England. Unlike his other journals, the Manchester Diary is unquestionably a true daily record. Written in a stream of consciousness style, it captures in-the-moment insights and reflections untouched by the passage of time or outside influence. In his Manchester Diary, Clayton records many curious things. His entries have astounding resemblance to details mentioned in Joseph Fielding's diary entry of September 2, 1841, when Fielding recounted what he had learned about spiritual wifery happening among the Mormons in Manchester. Clayton and the New Companion Revelation. To great familiarity. In his February 12, 1840 journal entry, Clayton writes, "My mother came this a.m. to say that she thought my wife was dissatisfied on account of my being from home, and it was hard for Moons, his in-laws, to keep her and children. Ruth and her family struggled in her husband's absence, but that did not deter the elder in his missionary work. His preoccupation was so intense that he rarely mentioned his wife, Ruth, and never by name. From January through September 1840 until Clayton and his family departed England, Clayton documented a total of 10 letters that he sent to her and a handful she sent in return. However, his diary is filled with many intimate details of interactions with local women. Although Clayton did conduct daily missionary activity, arguably the majority of his time was spent fraternizing with females. This fact is borne out first by the sheer amount of time Clayton spent alone with women, many of whom were eligible bachelorettes. He passed virtually every day, from morning until night, in the company of one or more women. Clayton ate nearly every meal, from morning breakfast to late night supper, with one or more women. He was constantly accompanied by one or more females on walks to and from ministerial appointments. He was almost never accompanied by a male companion during these visits. Among the many women he spent time with were Elizabeth Crooks, Margaret Jones, Elizabeth Dusnup, Elizabeth Battersby, Alice and Jane Hardman, and Booth and her daughter Sarah, and Mary Aspen, Betsy Poole, Sarah Perkins, Elizabeth Prince, and a number of others. He spent by far the most time with Rebecca Partington and Sarah Crooks. Except for the brief trips Clayton took outside of Manchester, during the months of February through the end of May, when he began his preparations to leave for America, Clayton was in the company of Sarah and Rebecca nearly every day. Fraternization between that many women and a married missionary, even if it were purely platonic, could certainly be considered too great familiarity. However, it is in the substance of these interactions, not merely the frequency of their mention, where this familiarity is clearly demonstrated. Select little company, choice band. Fielding mentioned a select little company, or choice band, that met clandestinely and thought themselves above the common saints. They kept their revelations under an apparent strict oath of secrecy. This little company appears to have taught and believed a form of spiritual wifery. The account suggests that the majority of the choice band were females, creating a conveniently imbalanced ratio. In his own writings, Clayton describes many meetings at which 2 or more participants, mostly female, were present with him. 1 or 2 other men are mentioned on rare occasions. His meetings with women occurred most frequently at the Hardman boarding house and at Thomas Miller's, where the women were present around meal times. He also met at William Miller's and possibly a few other locations where mostly females were present. These meetings appear to have been more social in nature rather than ecclesiastical visits or gatherings. Quite often, grievances were aired and jealousies expressed, leaving the reader to wonder what could have caused such constant strife amongst these women. Women also frequently gave Clayton money and fruit as gifts. For example, on January 13th, he took supper at Thomas Miller's. While there he was met by Sarah Crooks, Rebecca Partington, Sarah Perkins, and Betsy Crooks. Sarah Crooks was grieved at Sarah Perkins for being hurt over some little thing. During his visit, several of the sisters gave him 20 shillings to buy new pants. On the 25th, he had supper at Hardman's with several of the sisters. On the 5th of February, Clayton was again at the Hardman's with many of the sisters, who gave him money and fruit. He discussed relationship troubles with one of the women. On February 22nd, Clayton was at Thomas Miller's again for supper. He was joined by Susan Miller, Betsy Crooks, and Margaret Jones. Susan was upset at something, and Betsy was low because she had given way to her temper. These types of entries are frequent throughout the diary. As far as the record portrays, Clayton was ardently fixated on women other than his wife, who was virtually absent from his diary. Many strange visions. In late 1841, Fielding wrote of women who had many strange visions and dreams. They prophesied judgments such as this: 1. That an elder's wife would die, and he should be married to another certain person. Appearing to corroborate Fielding, on the 19th of January, 1840, Clayton writes, "There has been several dreams in the church concerning my wife during the last 10 days. 5 women related dreams to Clayton that have a similar resonance to what Fielding recorded in the fall of 1841. Clayton records that Betsy Dusnup and Margaret Jones both had the same dream in which they saw Clayton at Hardman's with one child in great trouble, and the child was crying for bread. In the women's dreams, Clayton asked the women to get the child something to eat while he went somewhere else. Catherine Beets told Clayton of a dream she had that day. She dreamt that Clayton was stripped and in the greatest trouble. My wife was either dead or near to dying, and I had one child with me. On the 23rd of January, Clayton writes that Sister Mary Hardman has dreamed about seeing my wife with her hair down upon her back all in disorder. She seemed in distress and was come to Manchester to seek me, but I was gone to Burslem. No children with her. Fielding additionally mentions that some who came from America went far beyond engaging in the familiarity that we had ever done or sanctioned, so much so that Elder C went in to bed with different women. Evidently, some of the American missionaries had a measurable influence on the Manchester saints, and especially on Elder C. The American brethren that William Clayton mentions in his journal at this time were Elders Wilford Woodruff, Willard Richards, and Hiram Clark. Clayton reports that these men had an influence on his friend Sarah Crooks, so much that she told him that she dreamed that one of the American brethren was talking and joking me Clayton about having a second wife, and Sarah joked, etc. So she thought I had then a second wife. Sarah Crooks' dream exemplifies Fielding's report of American brethren having an effect on Manchester Mormons, as they did on Elder C. The dreams of Betsy Dusnup, Margaret Jones, Catherine Beets, Mary Hardman, and Sarah Crooks regarding Clayton's marriage and family are remarkable corroboration of Fielding's account of Manchester women having strange visions and dreams. Clayton himself had evocative dreams where he was an eligible bachelor with many desirable potential mates. He records, "I dreamt I was in the middle of a garden full of ripe fruit, and after bringing some home was going again, and my wife ran up a hill before me and vanished out of my sight. Another night, I dreamed that I was at Hodson's Penwitham amongst ripe gooseberries. As above, I felt like a single or unmarried person." Here Clayton dreamt of feeling like an unmarried man in the midst of ripe fruit, a well-known literary symbol for sexual temptation. He later recorded other highly symbolic dreams that carried equally portentous messages. In September 1841, Fielding wrote of a woman that had once pronounced a curse or woe upon me, and prophetesses that had prophesied, who would stand and who would not. On March 6, 1840, Clayton's account of another woman's dream and prophesying is uncanny in its resemblance. She also saw in a dream 12 small children dressed in white. One of them was Brother Richard's child. She knew that it came down and sat on his shoulder and bending down looked in his face. The scene closed. She says Brother Richards will not live long. He is expecting a many things, but in some he will be disappointed. She says she foresaw all that has taken place concerning Arthur Smith, and she prophesies bad concerning Sis Mary, which etc. The woman's dream and prophecy are striking. Not only did she pronounce a sort of curse on Willard Richards, but she prophesied concerning Arthur Smith and Mary, which Arthur Smith was about to be married to Betsy Holden, a married woman. Betsy's husband was a soldier who had left for India around 4 years prior, and Betsy had not heard from him for about 3 or 4 years. There was no evidence that he was dead or had divorced her. Arthur Smith claimed to have had a vision that began the union with Betsy. Arthur and Betsy married that Arthur's vision, and this woman who foresaw what happened with Arthur Smith and Betsy Holden is further confirmation of the companion revelation. Mary, which is often referred to as Mary Powell in Clayton and Fielding's journals. She was a widow who was in a relationship with a much younger man, John Witch. They were living together in the same house and were in a romantic, possibly sexual relationship. Mary married John on January 28, 1840, and adopted the last name of Witch by the time of this March 6 dream entry. It is important to note that this sister's strange visions and prophecies concerning Arthur Smith and Mary, which are significant, because they show that the companion revelation was not merely about identifying companions in a future or premortal life. Fielding's phrase was, "It was shown them who should be companions in another world." On its own, this could be read as the Manchester saints receiving revelations about companions they would have after death or before birth. However, the March 6th entry makes clear that this Manchester woman was receiving manifestations and prophesying about relationships in the here and now. Arthur Smith reportedly had a vision of his new companion, who was already a married woman, and another woman received a manifestation confirming their companionship. The same woman also prophesied ill concerning Mary which, who had been living with a man before marrying him. These remarkable entries from Clayton's diary clearly show women receiving many strange visions related to the distress and possible dissolution of Clayton's marriage and family. Clayton's record details stark examples of prophetesses prophesying judgments and curses. Sarah Crooks and Clayton's dreams even alluded to the possibility of his having a new companion. All of this is in stark alignment with Fielding's account. Perhaps one of the most arresting instances in the diary that resonates strongly with elements of the new companion revelation is found in what Clayton relates about his friends, Susan and Thomas Miller. On the 19th of February, 1840, Clayton ate breakfast at Hardman's. He saw Betsy Poole, who told him that Susan Miller was jealous of her husband, Thomas. Betsy reported to William, "Thomas wants Susan out of the way. If she was to die, he would be married again in 3 months, and Thomas wanted to know who he would be married to, and she would not tell him. He says he will not go to his work until she does tell him, and she says she will not. Thomas is very much troubled, and Thomas has practiced kissing all in the house before he goes to bed, etc." This entry is startling in its similarity to Fielding's report of a sister who dreamt that an elder's wife would die and he should be married to another certain person. Fielding records that it was mostly females who received the manifestations of who should be companions in another world. Likewise, in Clayton's account, it was Susan, not her husband Thomas, who learned who his companion should be. Clayton indicates that during this time, Thomas made a practice of kissing whatever women were in the house at the time. Clearly, this would be right in line with Fielding's description of too great familiarity between brethren and sisters in Manchester. In the following days, Clayton describes the effect this manifestation had on Thomas and Susan Miller. On February 21st, he ate supper at their home, where Sarah Crooks was present. Susan was so troubled with jealousy that she wept and told Clayton she had heard that Thomas had intended to buy Sarah Isherwood a new cloak. The next day, after another visit to the Millers for supper with several sisters, Clayton notes that Susan was still grieved. 2 days later, Clayton again spent the day at the Miller home, where several sisters were also present. He learned that Thomas had struck Susan that morning, though he quickly repented and desired that they both might begin anew. Susan forgave him. Later that day, an argument broke out among the sisters. Margaret Jones was grieved with Betsy Crooks and said she wanted to leave the Millers, prompting an outburst from Betsy. Clayton records, "Betsy Crooks is grieved at them all. She says they use her unkindly, call her a hypocrite, and says she has made up her mind to leave the church. I feel to weep over her. There seems to be a spirit of contention amongst them." Sometime during this visit, Clayton advised the saints to give up the practice of kissing. Perhaps he recognized that Thomas and others engaging in the practice had helped stir the spirit of contention he witnessed that day. An observation should be made about Clayton's reference to this practice of kissing. Clayton's biographer James B. Allen offers this interpretation. The Manchester Saints, as well as some other English members, had another intriguing custom. They took seriously Paul's suggestion to the Romans that they salute one another with a holy kiss, and often did so as they gathered for meetings. Allen appears to base this conclusion on George Smith's 1847 memoir, in which Smith recalls, "It appears that some of the elders who had been raised up in England had taught that there was no harm in greeting each other with a holy kiss, and that some of those who had labored in Manchester had set an example of this kind." Allen's claim that the Manchester Saints sincerely followed the New Testament admonition overlooks key contextual evidence. While it is possible that some elders initially encouraged the practice, the way it developed in Manchester was unlike the holy kiss practiced by other 19th century Christian sections. Among Anabaptists, Mennonites, and Brethren groups, the kiss was a solemn ritual, apparently performed exclusively man to man or woman to woman, often in association with foot washing, and always with an air of reverence and restraint. The Manchester practice was something else entirely. On April 18, 1840, George A. Smith arrived in Manchester and visited the Hardman boarding house. He was greeted by a group of about 20 sisters, many of them young and handsome. One young woman, a little beauty, as Smith puts it, approached him at the urging of the others and said demurely, "Brother Smith, we want a kiss of you." Smith writes that all eyes were fixed on him, flashing like stars on a clear night. Deeply embarrassed, he had to summon some resolution to tell her that kissing was no part of his mission to England. The sisters' countenances fell, and from that moment, though Smith was a bachelor, he was regarded as no lady's man. Just a few months later, on July 7th, a church council was held at the Millennial Star office in Manchester. Elder Parley Pratt presided over the meeting, which included Mission President Joseph Fielding, Willard Richards, Brigham Young, and other elders and officers. The practice of kissing, which had become common in Manchester, was formally addressed. The council did not view it as a holy ritual. Brigham Young spoke of the evil of it and asked Fielding, with whom it had begun. Fielding replied that he believed it had started with the women of Manchester. The council resolved that no one should be condemned, but it was shown that the practice was best set aside, or it would lead to evil. Clearly, the Manchester Saints' kissing practice, possibly initiated by the sisters, was not understood as a sacred rite. It appears instead to have been part of what Fielding describes elsewhere as too great familiarity between brethren and sisters in this land. The practice that Clayton warned against was most likely connected to his friend Thomas Miller's behavior, specifically his kissing all the women in the house before bedtime. That casual intimacy seems to have contributed to Susan Miller's jealousy and grief, especially when coupled with Thomas's demand of Susan to disclose the identity of his new companion. Susan's forgiveness of Thomas after he struck her proved short-lived. 3 days later, on February 27th, Clayton returned to the Millers and found Susan ready to leave Thomas and break up house, saying she could not bear it. She was weary of having too much work. Perhaps so. We don't know whether she ever followed through. But Thomas's desire to know who his new companion should be apparently did not subside. He would eventually take a second companion, or spiritual wife, named Elizabeth Thompson. Clayton's account of Thomas and Susan Miller not only provides compelling corroboration of the companion revelation, but also demonstrates its destructive effects. On February 28, 1840, Clayton wrote to Elder Willard Richards about what had happened. He reports, "Thomas Miller and wife are about to break up house again. The poor girls will again be left without a home. I only feel too much for them." Clayton was clearly affected by the Millers' deteriorating relationship. Just prior to his mention of the Millers' troubles, in the same letter, Clayton reveals a private struggle of his own. He shares with Richards that he was perplexed with a temptation which I have been so much troubled with of late. Would to God from it. It is like a sword piercing my very soul. It will teach me to bear with the weaknesses of my brethren and sisters. Clayton doesn't elaborate on the temptation in the letter to Richards, but he does do so in his diary. The previous evening, Clayton was with Sarah Crooks and Rebecca Partington at the Hardmans, where all three were living at the time. Clayton told the women about Susan Miller's plans to leave her husband. Clayton then records this startling admission. Rebecca seemed much troubled, and Sarah appeared rather tempted to get married. I felt to sorrow on this account. I don't want Sarah to be married. I was much troubled and tempted on her account, and felt to pray that the Lord would preserve me from impure affections. That I certainly feel my love towards her to increase, but shall strive against it. I feel too much to covet her, and afraid lest her troubles should cause her to get married. The Lord keep me pure and preserve me from doing wrong. The sword piercing his soul was Clayton's temptation toward Sarah Crooks. When considering whether Elder C. is William Clayton, it is important to recognize what his own words reveal about him. Much later, in 1874, Clayton signed a sworn affidavit in which he references Sarah. Regarding his relationship with her, he claims that there was nothing farther than an attachment such as a brother and sister in the church might rightfully entertain for each other. Clayton's February 27th entry suggests that his later sworn statement in his affidavit is less than truthful. The remainder of his journal demonstrates beyond a reasonable doubt that his relationship with Sarah was far more than an innocent attachment. By this point in the investigation of Fielding's Elder C., there is already strong indication that he is in reality William Clayton. Clayton's documentation of too great familiarity is frequent. His numerous mentions of strange visions and dreams received mostly by women and related to his wife and family are stunning. His own dreams of being a single man tempted by fruit other than his wife are telling. Clayton's account of his friends Thomas and Susan Miller's conflict over Susan knowing who her husband's new companion would be is compelling. And Clayton's admission of his love and temptation for Sarah Crooks reveals just how overly familiar he had become with her. All of this is unmistakably in line with Fielding's description of the companion revelation and his description of Elder C. To fully draw the conclusion, however, it is important to closely examine Clayton's relationships with the women in Manchester, and especially with Sarah Crooks. William, Sarah, and different women. Clayton first mentions Sarah Crooks on January 13, 1840. It is not clear when their relationship began. A journal from Clayton prior to January 1840 is not extant. He had been serving as a missionary for over 18 months by this point. Yet, by February 27th, he was discernibly in love with her. Although for a moment he desired to curb his covetous desires for her, that desire apparently was short-lived. The two spent increasingly more time together at various hours of the day and night. Clayton was in Manchester the majority of each month from February through May. And whenever he was there, his time with Sarah steadily increased until he spent nearly every day with her. Over those months, they shared many intimate conversations and moments together. They took long walks, wrote letters, and handed them to each other, and talked long into the night after supper. Oftentimes, Sarah would accompany Clayton to ministerial appointments. It was not unusual for Clayton to be alone with her. Sometimes they were accompanied by her best friend, Rebecca. As all three lived at Hardman's, it was convenient for a late-night conversation after supper to continue into breakfast the next morning. Aside from being with Sarah virtually every day that he was in Manchester from the end of March to the end of May, Clayton records interactions with Sarah, Rebecca, and other women that are quite revealing. After an evening of preaching on March 30th, four women accompanied Clayton on the 4-mile walk home from Prestwich to Manchester. Clayton's feet were very sore when he arrived home to find Sarah there. She gave him a pint of warm porter. Clayton then described something quite unexpected and puzzling. Sarah washed Clayton's feet. Even in today's morally permissive climate, a young woman washing a married man's feet while alone together in either one's apartment might raise eyebrows. At the very least, it would likely elicit a conversation about healthy and appropriate boundaries from concerned family, friends, and especially the man's wife. But in the burgeoning Victorian era, displays of physical intimacy such as this were undoubtedly seen as a serious breach of decorum. Even if only symbolic or ritualistic, such a display would still be an inappropriate level of familiarity between the sexes. Even among the working class in Manchester, where social norms could be somewhat less rigid, any such act would most assuredly put Sarah's reputation at tremendous risk, whether it was innocent or not. Clayton's involvement would likely have been seen as a serious betrayal of his marriage. And this was only the first of 8 occasions when Sarah would wash Clayton's feet. On April 1, 1840, Clayton returned to the Hardmans, where Mother Elizabeth Hardman and Sarah Crooks were waiting for him. Clayton and Sarah ate a late supper together, and afterwards she again washed his feet. She told him about a dream she had the previous night. She thought a man brought a young man before her and said he was to be her companion. Apparently, Sarah had her own manifestation regarding a new companion for herself, similar to what Susan Miller had learned regarding her husband, Thomas. Clayton tried to persuade her that her dream was not true. Sarah was troubled and thought in her own mind she would not be in a hurry. Immediately after the journal entry where Clayton relates Sarah's dream, 5 lines have been redacted with dark pencil. April 3rd began with breakfast at the Hardmans. Clayton spent the afternoon at dinner and coffee at Sister Booth's and was joined by a number of sisters. He learned of trouble between Sister and Booth and her husband Robert, going from house to house abusing his wife and idling, etc. After receiving gifts from Sister Booth and her daughter Sarah and Betsy and Christiana Crooks and Sister Mary Aspen, Clayton returned home to have supper with Sarah Crooks. On the evening of April 6th after preaching, Clayton returned home by 11 o'clock to have supper with Sarah and Rebecca. They gave him a pint of porter. Afterward, Sarah again washed his feet. Apparently, all the time they were spending together did not go unnoticed by others. On April 7th, after Clayton, Sarah, and Rebecca ate dinner, Clayton had a private conversation with Sarah. She told him that it seems that the saints generally appear to envy her and feel a little jealous for some cause which they will not make known. Perhaps Sarah and Clayton did not know why the saints were envious of Sarah, but it seems most likely that it was due to the special attention their beloved elder was giving to her. Clayton notes that even Rebecca seemed very much grieved at Sarah, but I think she is mending of it. The jealousy may even have touched Sarah's best friend, but the reader is left puzzled, for after the mention of Rebecca being upset with Sarah, 21 lines are penciled over in dark lead, making the underlying text illegible. After Clayton returned home from an evening of preaching on April 8, 1840, Sarah was waiting with some egg milk for him at 11 o'clock p.m. After spending some time together, Clayton records, "She washed my feet, and I then went to bed." Clayton was again alone with Sarah on the night of April 18th, after returning home from a conference in Preston. She gave him a pint of porter and told him of a curious conversation she had that day with Sister Kathy Beets. Apparently, Kathy had a manifestation and felt to warn Sarah that great trouble was coming upon her, and she must keep herself single, for she would scarce have an inch of ground to stand upon. Sarah was so deeply upset by Kathy's prophecy that the next morning she wept much on account of what Sister Catherine said to her. It appears Sarah was yearning for a companion, and Sister Beets' prophecy upset her greatly. Despite being so troubled, Sarah kindly attended to Clayton, who had a splitting headache. Clayton went to Elizabeth Prince's to take cocoa on April 25th after attending to some business in the morning. Sarah's sister, Elizabeth Crooks, was also there and was very full of trouble. She'd had a good deal of conversation with Mary Dara. Apparently, Mary Dara had many objections against the work and also objected to contradictions in the Bible regarding Jacob and David having more wives. Curiously, Clayton then writes, "I reasoned with her and she was satisfied and said she would have been baptized had it not been late." It appears that Mary Dara's concerns reveal that part of the work of the elders in Manchester was teaching regarding biblical polygamy. Clayton was able to reason with her until her concerns regarding polygamy were satisfied. Sarah and Clayton had an intimate conversation over breakfast on the morning of April 27, 1840. Sarah shared an experience she had as a younger schoolgirl with a young man named George Buchanan, who she used to keep company with. She confided in Clayton that her relationship with George had caused some reports about her that had been spread abroad. Clayton's account reveals that Sarah continued to feel troubled over this matter. After Clayton's recording of this conversation, the next 10 lines on the page are penciled over. The following night, before retiring to bed, Sarah again washed Clayton's feet. Clayton began his day on April 29th, as usual at breakfast with Sarah. After a day of ministering and preaching, Clayton returned home at 11:30 p.m. to find Sarah waiting. She once again washed his feet and gave him supper. On her birthday, April 30th, Clayton makes a special note. Spent much of the day with Sarah and took water with her. Sarah's birthday, 23 years old, by the end of April, their relationship and level of intimacy had grown considerably. On the evening of May 1st, 1840, Clayton learned that Sister Sands was took very dangerously ill through miscarriage. She has been growing careless, had hardness against me, and was giving way to the world. She says she will be better. It seems strange that Clayton would report this sister's anger at the same time as he reports news of her miscarriage. Given the likelihood that Elder Clayton is the Elder C described by Fielding, the one who went to bed with different women, Sister Sands' anger towards Clayton is potentially more understandable. It is possible that Clayton had some hand in her state of pregnancy, either by his encouragement of her behavior or perhaps even by his own interaction with her. Under the companion revelation, married men and women could have new companions outside their current marriages. Under this license, Sister Sands might well have considered herself free to have a new companion. Finally, the phrase Clayton uses, that she has been growing careless, is intriguing. Was she careless merely with her health in a state of pregnancy? Or did her carelessness lead to becoming pregnant? Precise answers are not available, but the questions are warranted. On May 2nd, Clayton spent much of the evening upstairs with Sarah and Rebecca, noting with tenderness that before they ate supper together, Sarah had repaired his clothes and shewed much kindness. His reference to spending the evening upstairs with his female friends is significant. In working-class Victorian homes, the upstairs rooms were private bedroom spaces. That Clayton, Sarah, and Rebecca were alone together in such a setting is noteworthy. It would have been highly improper for a married man to be alone with women, not his wife, in a bedroom. In fact, it appears that nearly all of Clayton's late-night interactions with Sarah and Rebecca after supper at the Hardman's place, including the intimate occasions when Sarah washed Clayton's feet, took place upstairs in the bedroom area. Clayton and Sarah were together daily for the next week. On May 6th, she washed his feet before bed. On the morning of May 9th, Sarah confided in him about previous troubles she had and the liberty with which people, most likely men, had taken with her beforetime and how she suffered by it. From May 10th to 13th, he left Manchester. When he returned, Sarah was again waiting for him. Late in the day on May 17th, Clayton had some conversation with Alice Hardman's cousin, Jane Hardman. She is a very nice young woman and does not seem to object to anything. Over the next few days, he continued sharing porter, eating supper, and visiting with Sarah, Rebecca, and other young ladies. On the evening of Tuesday, May 19th, after Clayton and Sarah ate supper alone together, she poured him a pint of porter. Then, after washing his feet, they sat together till 2 o'clock in the morning. After spending the day with Rebecca on May 20th, 1840, Clayton learned that Alice and Hannah Hardman had tarried until near 11 with Brother Pratt. About 6 weeks earlier, these two had been with Clayton until 2 a.m., and a week later, Clayton used great liberty towards Alice Hardman. He didn't elaborate further. Using great liberty is an odd admission. Clayton could have meant he used frankness of speech with Alice on some subject, and that what he told her was purely within the bounds of decorum. However, there is another possibility. In Victorian England, the phrase "to take liberties" with someone generally referred to behaving in a way that was overly familiar, presumptuous, or disrespectful of social norms or personal boundaries. The phrase often carried connotations of impropriety. In this context, the liberty he used with Alice may have been romantic, sexual in nature, or some other display of too great familiarity. After the entry where Clayton wrote about Alice and Hannah meeting with Pratt at his apartment, 19 lines are penciled over on the May 20th, 1840 entry, making most of the lines illegible. But underneath the pencil the names Alice and Rebecca appear. We do not know what information elicited the redaction, but it appears possible it was in reference to Pratt's late-night meeting with Alice and Hannah and about Clayton's relationship with Alice. It is unclear as to whether Parley was aware of or participated in any way in the companion revelation, but Fielding's journal does mention that someone a new companion had been marked out for him, Parley Pratt. It is also not clear why Clayton and Pratt were meeting with the two young Hardman sisters late at night, or why Clayton took liberties with Alice. The only certain thing is that Alice later became Clayton's second plural wife. Parley Pratt became a prominent Nauvoo polygamist. He married his first plural wife, Elizabeth Brotherton, 3 years after Clayton's journal entry, after meeting her family in Manchester, her birthplace. On May 21st, Clayton traveled to Preston and returned home on May 27th. After a couple of ministerial appointments on the 28th, Clayton returned to Hardman's to find Brigham Young and Heber Kimball there. They visited for a while and sung some. Then Kimball and Young spake to each other in tongues. After eating supper with Sarah and Rebecca, Kimball went to Elizabeth Prince's to stay the night. The next day at the Hardman's place, Clayton was with Sarah, Rebecca, and other sisters. He recorded that he read the vision to some of the sisters, fell to good. Afterward, he had supper with Sarah and Rebecca. Clayton's wording here is unusual. He typically recorded sermons with clear citations, but here he cryptically notes the vision, without a proselytizing context. If it were a scriptural vision, he likely would have cited chapter and verse, as he usually did. He might have been referring to Joseph Smith's 1832 vision of the 3 degrees of glory, often called the vision, but as a new convert, Clayton may not have known this, and he never references Joseph's revelations in his preaching, only the Bible. He read the vision to a group of sisters at the Hardman house, where he met with women but did not preach. This suggests he deliberately left just enough detail for himself while obscuring it from others, raising the possibility that he was reading the very companion revelation Fielding later learned about. Things began to change for Sarah and Clayton in June 1840. It is unclear why, but they saw each other only 7 times that month. During the last part of June, Clayton traveled to his hometown. After a mission conference in Manchester in the first week of July, Clayton's focus appears to have shifted. He soon began preparing to take his family to America. He saw Sarah only once in July and twice in September before his departure. Clayton's own words and actions reveal an unmistakable intimacy between him and Sarah Crooks. His record reflects a pattern of inappropriate familiarity with women who were not his wife. This strengthens the case that Clayton was Fielding's elder C. But perhaps the most telling and troubling aspect of Clayton's diary is what is missing. The context of those omissions may offer the strongest confirmation and correlation to Fielding's account. Penciled over, 13 pages of Clayton's daily entries contain portions that have been heavily penciled over. Most of those pages have large portions that are redacted. Though Clayton could have done this himself later, it was more likely someone else. Perhaps a family member made the redactions much later. The important question is why? What was there to hide? The readable portions of Clayton's journal are already extremely revealing. He records interactions and interludes that he, as a married man, had with other women. He talks of new companionships. He records dreams and visions of feeling like a bachelor, tempted by ripe fruit, separate from his wife, and even of his wife dying. He expresses his love and soul-piercing temptation for Sarah Crooks. He documents intimate situations he was in with women late at night, many times having them wash his feet and serve him alcohol. What, then, would be so scandalous that it would need to be covered up? There are some clues as to the nature of the content. On page 12, 8 lines are penciled over in thick dark lead. Then he writes, Sarah and Rebecca brought cocoa to the room for me, immediately after the scribbles. On page 26, for the entry of February 19, 1840, Clayton Records. Came home and found Sarah Crooks here and Christiana, who was sick. We prayed with her. Sarah with the other. 3 lines are etched out after that. Page 32 for February 28 reads, Sarah Perkins gave me a pint of porter and some raisins. Sarah Crooks gave me 1 shilling. I objected, but she would make me have it. Rebecca went a little on the way with me. Then a line is scratched out. Page 35 for March 6, 1840 records that Clayton went to Sister Kathy Beats to dinner. Then 16 lines are penciled over. Under the etchings, you can clearly make out Sarah Crooks' name. What follows next is the previously mentioned prophesying and the dream about Willard Richards dying. It appears Sarah may be the one who had dreamt and prophesied. On page 44 for March 29th, after breakfast with Sarah and Rebecca, Clayton went to Stockport. Sarah and Rebecca went with me too. And 4 lines are scratched out obscuring what comes next. Sarah's name is visible beneath the redactions. Clayton then writes of a Robert Crooks, who was about to be confirmed in the church. It is not certain what Robert's relation was to Sarah. Clayton next refers to a conversation he and Robert had. He seems very humble and comfortable with Sarah. He has had a deal of hard feelings against her, but all seems to be gone after all. I feel to have little hopes that he will hold out to the end. I believe he will again turn against us and be cut off and dash on the next page. 17 lines are redacted. On April 1st, 1840, page 46, Clayton Records being with Sarah Crooks. After washing Clayton's feet, Sarah shared the dream she had of a new companion. The next 5 lines are etched out. On page 48, April 7th, after dinner with Sarah and Rebecca, Clayton records his conversation with Sarah where she told him about the saints envying her. The following 21 lines are scratched out. The phrase, "I told her," appears at the end of the redactions, after which he dined with Sarah. In the April 27th entry on page 50, appears the aforementioned lengthy conversation with Sarah that Clayton records about a young man she used to keep company with, George Buchanan. After this intimate conversation, 10 lines are scratched out. Underneath the redactions, the names Betsy Crooks and Sarah Crooks are visible. On May 6th, page 56, Sarah washed Clayton's feet at the end of the day. The next morning, they ate breakfast together. He ended the next day having supper with Sarah and Rebecca. 2 lines are then redacted that on page 60, May 20th, Clayton began the day with breakfast with Rebecca. He saw her again later for cocoa. He mentions that Alice and Hannah Hardman went to Bro Pratt's and tarried till near 11. Then 19 lines are scratched out. Underneath those pencil scratches, the names Alice, Rebecca, and Sarah can be read clearly. The phrase "she would never love" is discernible. The purpose of detailing these entries is to highlight what should now be evident. Every redaction is directly tied to Clayton's interactions with women. Immediately before and after almost every redaction, Clayton is with Sarah or Rebecca or discussing them or other women. Under many of the redactions, Sarah's, Rebecca's, Alice's, and Betsy's names are visible. The potentially shocking details may never be made known. Yet one thing is for certain. Something about Clayton and the Manchester women has been purposefully covered up. Concluding Clayton as Elder C. By this point, the similarities between Fielding's description of the companion revelation and Clayton's Manchester diary, January to June 1840, are striking. Fielding describes visions, dreams, and secret meetings where a choice band of mostly women receive divine manifestations, visions and dreams regarding spiritual companions, events Clayton records in detail, including cases involving Susan and Thomas Miller, Sarah and Betsy Crooks, and others. Clayton's diary also reveals his deep feelings for Sarah Crooks, including intimate foot-washing rituals and redactions on 13 pages related to his interactions with women. His behavior, particularly his too great familiarity with Sarah Crooks, suggests both motive and opportunity for sexual relationships outside his marriage. He even records sleeping at women's homes. On February 25, 1840, he went to Sarah Perkins to sleep unusual, given his residency at the Hardman boarding house. On June 13th, Clayton records a curious entry regarding one of Sarah Crooks' sisters. About 2 o'clock this a.m., Elizabeth Crooks began in her sleep to sing in tongues. She spoke and sung in about 7 languages, occupying about 2 hours. It was typical for Clayton to record his conversations and identify who reported information to him. Had he learned about Eliza Crooks singing in tongues from someone else, he likely would have noted the source. The fact that he describes the striking event in detail, while omitting any such reference, strongly suggests that he was in the room with her at 2 a.m. and personally observed the singing, which lasted over 2 hours. Given his many accounts of late-night conversations with women that extended into the morning at breakfast, it is not only possible, but likely, that Clayton witnessed the event himself. When Fielding mentions Elder C had often slept with Sister P and said there was no harm in it, he could be referring to several women Clayton mentioned often, including Sarah Perkins, Eliza Prince, whom Clayton frequently visited, Betsy Poole, who washed his feet, or Rebecca Partington, who lived with Clayton at the Hardmans and spent the most alone time with him. Given Clayton's interactions with these women, the possibility that he was sexually involved with one of them cannot be dismissed. All of this strongly suggests that Fielding's Elder C is indeed William Clayton, and that Clayton was the one going into bed with different women. This evidence provides a new understanding of who William Clayton was as a young man, husband, father, and missionary. Indeed, this evidence helps us understand Clayton as one who would find himself at the center of similar activities emerging just years later in Joseph Smith's Nauvoo. From Manchester to Nauvoo. In September 1840, Clayton emigrated to America. A number of the women he knew well in Manchester also emigrated to Nauvoo. Understanding what he writes about later interactions with these same women is critical to assessing the significance of the information presented in this paper. In early 1843, over a year after his arrival in Nauvoo, Clayton began in earnest to take spiritual wives. His initial pursuits were focused almost exclusively on women he associated with on his Manchester mission. In February 1843, Clayton wrote to Sarah Crooks and sent her money for passage to America. He had an interview with Alice Hardman on April 9th. On April 19th, he met with Sister and Booth from Manchester. On April 22nd and 23rd, Clayton conversed with Margaret Moon, his wife Ruth's sister from his hometown of Preston, about the priesthood. On April 30th, and Booth informed Clayton that her daughter, Sarah, would obey her instructions. Mary Aspen from England met with Clayton on May 11th, 1843. On May 13th, Jane Hardman, Alice's cousin, met with Clayton at his house. By May 31st, when Sarah Crooks arrived in Nauvoo, Clayton had already been sealed to Margaret Moon in a spiritual marriage, and she was pregnant with his baby. In addition to Margaret, Clayton pursued all of these women as spiritual wives with alacrity over the next year and a half. After obtaining permission from Heber Kimball, Clayton successfully added Alice Hardman as a spiritual wife on September 13, 1844. Strangely, Alice also married Austin Sturgis civilly on November 3, 1844. It's not certain how long she was married to Sturgis, but Alice continued to have contact with Clayton over the next few years. Alice eventually rejoined Clayton's family and had 4 children with him. On October 19th, Clayton had a telling dream. Was married to Brother Alpheus Cutler's youngest daughter, and she seemed as happy as an angel, and I felt full of joy and peace. I thought I had received Miss Cutler in addition to those I had already got. When I awoke, I felt disappointed and felt to pray in my heart, O God, if it be Thou wilt give me that woman for a companion, and my soul shall praise Thee, but Thy will be done and not mine. Clayton's dream is highly reminiscent of the companion revelation, which declared that it was shown them who should be companions. It appears that the influence of the companion revelation followed Clayton years after his exposure to it in Manchester. The following evening, Clayton went to Booth's home. They talked privately at length. She told Clayton that her daughter, Sarah Ann, was unhappy and wanted to meet with Clayton. Sarah Ann had married Jonathan Needham 1 year earlier, and further informed him that another woman, Jane Channock, was perfectly unhappy and wanted to be loosed from her marriage so Clayton could take her as a wife. This was not all, and related to Clayton that Mary Aspen was ready to unite to Clayton as her savior and spiritual husband. Finally, and indicated she also wanted out of her marriage to her husband Robert and to be united to Clayton. Clayton indicates, she shall not risk her salvation in Robert's hands and wants me to interfere. Clayton's conversation with Booth hearkens to the companion revelations, teaching that marriages would not be united as they are now. The fact that these women were so quick to abandon their then current marriages with wishes to unite with Clayton as their new companion shows these women had fully accepted this teaching. This strong evidence indicates that perhaps they had learned this doctrine years earlier in Manchester and were already prepared to practice it. Though none of those women, and Sarah and Booth, Jane Channock, and Mary Aspen, ultimately became his wives, Clayton did add someone else as a spiritual wife. Jane Hardman was 5 months pregnant with a child by her husband William Whitehead, an immigrant from Manchester. While still married to Whitehead, Jane married Clayton as a spiritual wife. On November 20th, 1844, Clayton met with Jane Hardman at Brigham Young's house. President Young blessed her with the blessings of the everlasting covenant, and she was sealed up to eternal life and to William Clayton, for time and for all eternity. Jane gave birth to another boy in mid-July 1847, but the baby did not live long after birth. Tragically, on July 23rd, Jane also died. Just 3 days after arriving in Nauvoo, Sarah Crooks appeared willing to comply with her privilege and become Clayton's spiritual wife. A month earlier, Clayton had taken Margaret Moon as a new spiritual wife, and Margaret was already carrying his child. On June 3, 1843, Clayton Clayton took his new wife Margaret with Sarah Crooks to tour the steamboat of Iowa. That evening, Clayton had a conversation with Sarah and her friend from Manchester, Elizabeth Brotherton. On June 12th, Sarah went to visit Thomas Miller, who had immigrated from Manchester as well. The next morning, Clayton saw Sarah, and she gave him a letter. It appears that after this, Sarah turned away from Clayton. Clayton's record is silent as to why. On August 16, 1843, just over 2.5 months after her arrival in Nauvoo, she married William Cook. On April 18, 1844, Clayton records an unpleasant visit from Sarah, writing that she had a wicked spirit in her and will be cursed if she do not repent. On June 28, 1844, the day after the martyrdom of Joseph and Hiram Smith, Clayton penned the longest entry of his journaling career. He detailed the murders of the Smith brothers and, when listing the names of those involved, inexplicably includes William Cook and Sarah his wife, formerly Sarah Crooks of Manchester, England. Willard Richards writes this exact phrase into the official history of the church, immortalizing Clayton's claim. Clayton's journal entry is the only source known that ties his former love to the murders of the Smiths. Perhaps this is Clayton's attempt to get back at Sarah. He may have tried to rid his heart of her, but could not. On September 5, 1844, Clayton writes, "Last night I had a dream which gives me to understand that Sarah Cook is laying a snare for me, to destroy me." A few weeks later, he had a private conversation with Heber Kimball about Sarah Crooks after both men visited Alice Hardman. Just 7 days earlier, Clayton had taken Alice as a spiritual wife with Kimball's permission. After the visit, Clayton confided in Kimball, apparently, Sarah Crooks was still on his mind. Clayton recounts that Kimball said all the 12 were my very warmest friends, and he will help me to accomplish all my desires inasmuch as they are right. He says, I shall yet have Sarah Crooks. Kimball's promise to Clayton would not be fulfilled. Sarah remained married to William Cook and never did comply with her privilege to become Clayton's companion. These combined events demonstrate an undeniable relationship between Clayton's behavior with women in Manchester and his efforts to make many of the same women his spiritual wives in Nauvoo. Understanding this correlation helps bring clarity to the many bewildering things Clayton records the rest of his life about his practice of spiritual wifery. For example, Clayton writes in his journal on March 7, 1843, that he was instructed by Brigham Young on the principles of the priesthood, most likely those pertaining to the spiritual wife doctrine. It appears that from this conversation, Clayton received permission to begin taking spiritual wives, which he did almost immediately. Importantly, Clayton calls that permission a favor which I have long desired. On its own, this phrase is perplexing. How had he long desired something he had only just then come to know about? It should be evident by now that Clayton's connection to the companion revelation provides the clear answer. Clayton had actually been desiring spiritual companions long before he arrived in Nauvoo. Another important example is William Clayton's 1874 affidavit, which chronicles his supposed introduction to the practice of plural marriage. In the affidavit, Clayton declares he spoke with Joseph Smith in the month of February, 1843, date not remembered. He claims Joseph said he had learned about a sister, Sarah Crooks, back in England, to whom Clayton was very much attached. Clayton says he replied, "There was, but nothing further than an attachment such as a brother and sister in the church might rightfully entertain for each other." As previously exposed, this statement is demonstrably not true. Clayton also claims that Joseph told him he would give him the money to bring Sarah to Nauvoo. Clayton's own Nauvoo journal directly contradicts this part of his later account. Most importantly, Clayton claims the following about this conversation between him and Joseph Smith. It was the first time the prophet Joseph talked with me on the subject of plural marriage. He informed me that the doctrine and principle was right in the sight of our Heavenly Father, and that it was a doctrine which pertained to celestial order and glory. After giving me lengthy instructions and information concerning the doctrine of celestial or plural marriage, he concluded his remarks by the words, "It is your privilege to have all the wives you want." Clayton gives the clear impression in this account that this was the first time he had ever learned about plural marriage, not just from Joseph, but in general. This was his introduction to the principle of the plurality of wives. However, strong evidence in this paper indicates that years earlier, as Elder C. in Fielding's September 1841 account, Clayton had already practiced a form of spiritual wifery under the companion revelation. The spiritual wife system in England. The spiritual wifery that appears to have begun with the companion revelation continued on in England for years. Manchester Mormon Charles D. Miller, brother of Clayton's friend Thomas Miller, wrote in 1842 that he and his brother William believed taking plural wives was a true doctrine. In 1844, as mentioned previously, Mission President Reuben Hedlock wrote that he was having trouble with the spiritual wife system in England. It was causing much confusion amongst some of the branches in England. In 1846, Charles D. Miller wrote about a vivid dream he had concerning taking plural wives. That same year he recorded, "The knowledge of plurality of wives was at this time whispered among a few saints. Many were dissatisfied with their husbands and then felt to make covenants with others. Thus many of the saints got entangled, and a spirit of lasciviousness brooded over the churches in England. All was known to the presidency, and they sent 3 of the 12, and all was put in order again." Miller's observation is worth noting. By 1846, many of the 12 apostles were themselves practicing spiritual wifery. That 3 of the 12 were sent to England to try to extinguish the British spiritual wife practice is further strong evidence that what was happening in England was operating independently of, and perhaps even in tension with, the system that later emerged in Nauvoo. Yet, despite efforts to put it down, the British practice of spiritual wifery continued. In 1848, Thomas Miller was excommunicated for teaching the two-wife system and for taking Elizabeth Thompson as his second wife. A number of other men and women from Manchester, England, engaged in extramarital relationships that may have been influenced by the spiritual wife system, and were certainly consistent with Fielding's account. As mentioned previously, there was Arthur Smith and Betsy Holden. As well, in August 1839, Deacon Roger Parker was in a relationship with Alice Bleasdale, who, though unmarried, was by him pregnant. In January 1840, an older, married priest named Brother Heath went to bed with a young woman, Mary Ann Webb. In June 1840, James Mahone married Elizabeth Mills, though it was believed he was already married to another woman at the time. In January 1843, Manchester immigrants to Nauvoo, John Blizzard and Betsy Poole, were tried and excommunicated by the Nauvoo High Council for adultery. Betsy had left her husband, Daniel Poole, in England, and they had not divorced. She later persuaded the High Council that Daniel had mistreated her, and both she and John were shortly thereafter rebaptized. It is not certain whether all of these individuals were aware of or directly inspired by the companion revelation. Yet the behavior, attitudes, and relationships of many Manchester saints clearly fostered a moral climate receptive to it, and to the broader British practice of spiritual wifery. It is critical to note that all of this began and continued independently of Nauvoo spiritual wifery. Features of the English version appear distinct from Nauvoo, and especially later Utah polygyny and polyandry. The key distinction was in the women's role in the system. Charles Miller's statement that many women were unhappy with their husbands and felt to make covenants with other men indicates that women were empowered under this form of spiritual wifery to seek other companions. Therefore, it is likely that the British spiritual wife system that encouraged this liberty in women was an outgrowth of the companion revelation, which inspired mostly women to obtain manifestations regarding new companions. With Nauvoo's spiritual wifery and Utah polygamy, men directed the practice exclusively and women were subservient to it. Importantly, the occurrence of spiritual wifery in England was not a brief anomaly, but rather was a persistent phenomenon that began in the British mission and carried over to America. Conclusion. Clear contemporaneous records from 1840 to 1848, left by Joseph Fielding, William Clayton, the Nauvoo High Council, Charles Miller, Reuben Hedlock, Thomas Miller, and others, established beyond refutation that a form of spiritual wifery was being practiced during the first British mission. Fielding, in his diary entry of September 2, 1841, leaves a stunning account of an actual revelation promoting the practice. He describes a small group of Manchester saints who, under strict oath of secrecy, sought divine manifestations to identify new spiritual companions. He documents behaviors of a number of Mormons in England who may have been influenced by that companion revelation. Elder William Clayton's Manchester diary provides remarkable corroboration. He spent virtually every day alone with eligible bachelorettes during his mission and records highly inappropriate familiarity with them. He frequently describes meetings at the homes of the Hardmans, Thomas Miller, William Miller, and others, gatherings where mostly women were present. These meetings closely align with Fielding's description of the choice band. Clayton also documents strange visions and dreams, usually received by women and many related to his wife and family, that mirror Fielding's account of the new companion revelation. Like Fielding, Clayton recounts numerous instances of women prophesying judgments, curses, and woes. His record of Susan and Thomas Miller's relationship nearly replicates what Fielding describes, especially Susan's dream revealing who her husband's next companion should be if she were to die. Clayton openly confesses to sexual temptation and love for Sarah Crooks and documents an astonishing level of intimacy in his daily interactions with her. He even records a dream Sarah had about receiving a new companion. Clayton's documentation of 9 instances of women washing his feet, 8 of which involve Sarah Crooks, demonstrates an extraordinary degree of personal familiarity, deeply inappropriate for a married missionary in Victorian England. His detailed record of his relationship with Sarah makes both of them likely members of the choice band. The 13 pages of redactions in his journal focused on his interactions with women, and where the names Sarah, Rebecca, Alice, and Betsy are still faintly visible beneath the pencil marks, suggest even more damning material has deliberately been obscured. Clayton even writes that he spent the night at one sister's house and possibly another, where he heard her sing in tongues in her sleep. He frequently mentions sisters with surnames beginning in P, any of whom could be the sis. P that Elder C went to bed with. The fact that 8 of the women Clayton associated with in Manchester and Preston later became his first plural wives in Nauvoo is beyond coincidence. All the evidence presented thus far strongly supports the conclusion that William Clayton is the Elder C, whom Fielding describes as sleeping with different women and regularly going to bed with Sister P after persuading them that it was no harm. Identifying Clayton as Fielding's Elder C not only offers stunning corroboration of Fielding's account, it radically deepens our understanding of its implications. It also seems clear that Theodore Turley, also guilty of going to bed with multiple women, is the Elder T mentioned by Fielding, though it remains uncertain whether he was officially part of the Manchester choice band. As for Parley Pratt, while Fielding notes that a companion had been chosen for him, it's unclear whether Pratt was aware or directly involved. Still, Pratt certainly knew of the companion revelation, as he discussed it with Fielding. Yet there is no evidence that he acted on this knowledge. No letter, report, or public statement survives from Pratt or anyone else about the spiritual wifery taking place in the first British mission. This silence is striking that if an apostle had learned of such a controversial practice, one might reasonably expect him to notify the leadership in Nauvoo, especially Joseph Smith. But no such report exists. Why? Given Pratt's connections to the Hardman sisters and to Sarah Crooks while in Manchester, his public promotion of an unusual interaction between men and women, his earlier moral scandal in 1837 and his later plural marriages, it is plausible that he was a member of the choice band and a participant in Manchester spiritual wifery. From this examination, important questions arise. Since the English practice of spiritual wifery predated the practice in Nauvoo, did the English version also have an influence on what occurred in Nauvoo? Did other early Nauvoo polygamists choose their first plural wives from England, as Clayton did? Since William Clayton was not truthful in his 1874 sworn affidavit concerning his relationship with Sarah Crooks and his introduction to polygamy, should his other statements about how he entered the practice be re-examined? Are there journals, letters, or other writings from missionaries or British saints that remain unpublished? What was Parley Pratt's full involvement? Did British spiritual wifery extend beyond this group in Manchester and Preston, and did it involve other notable Mormons? Perhaps the most important question is, Who received the companion revelation? It seems clear it was not given under Joseph Smith's direction, and there is no evidence he even knew of it. So, among the Manchester Saints in 1840, who was most likely to have received it? William Clayton is a possibility. But for such a radical revelation to take hold, the person revealing it would need to command sufficient respect and hold proper authority. Ecclesiastical standing mattered deeply to Latter-day Saints. Clayton's highest office at the time was second counselor in the mission presidency under Joseph Fielding. Ever the devoted follower rather than a bold initiator, Clayton seems an unlikely source for such a doctrinal innovation. Fielding notably said the revelation was considered not lawful to disclose, even to him, the high priest and president of the British mission, with Joseph Smith absent, who among them could have credibly introduced it. These questions deserve close scrutiny. The critical point is this: the contemporary record shows that the British practice of spiritual wifery was independent of, and in fact predated, the system later formalized in Nauvoo. There is no evidence that Joseph Smith initiated or approved it. As such, the traditional and widely accepted narrative of the origins of Mormon polygamy must be re-examined.